Hello, everyone, and welcome to Masks, Vaccines, and Back to the Worksite, What Employers Need to Know. I'm Amy Music, Coordinator of Strategic Partnerships for the New Jersey Business and Industry Association. With us today is Joel Greenwald and Zev Singer from Greenwald Dougherty. Joel is the managing partner and Zev is a partner of Greenwald Dougherty, a national management side employment law firm that has built and fine-tuned an innovative and individualized model for representing all types and sizes of companies, allowing leaders to focus on their business goals. The firm's experienced attorneys advise, counsel, and train businesses on day-to-day and cutting-edge employment law issues, helping to create and maintain a better workplace environment for each client. A few housekeeping matters before we get started. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be emailed to you tomorrow, so be on the lookout for that. But I'd also like to draw your attention to the questions tab. Joel and Zev would be happy to take your questions, so get them in as they come to you via the questions chat box. One last thing, it's definitely been getting better, but we've still been noticing people having audio and visual issues with the GoToWebinar platform as they struggle to keep up with all the extra video conferencing that's been going on right now. If you have any trouble viewing or hearing during the presentation, don't forget you will automatically be receiving a recording within 24 hours. So if you have to sign out and watch the recording, you won't miss a thing. So now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers.
Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you to the NJPIA for having us today on this somewhat rainy Friday, depending on where you're sitting. As Amy mentioned, our firm is a labor and employment law firm. We do exclusively, we represent management, employers, and all hosts of labor and employment issues. And as you can imagine, over the past year and a half, a lot of that's been focused on the pandemic and masks and vaccines. So we're here today to talk a little bit about that. We always say this, and I think it's more applicable today than ever. What we say today really is applicable today, and that's at 10 o'clock on this Friday morning. And it could change in an hour, it could change in a day. In fact, many of you heard last week that what New Jersey did as far as this mask issue, which we're about to get into, where first masks have to stay on, then they can only come off. Then it changes day by day, hour by hour. So just keep that in mind as you're out there, that this is applicable as we're sitting here today, but it could change very quickly. Also, of course, what we're saying here today is not legal advice. It's an informational webinar. We're happy to have a discussion. We love questions, as Amy mentioned. We try to make this more of a dialogue. We definitely want to leave some significant time at the end to answer any questions you have out there. But again, it's not legal advice. Don't tell us your company name or your employees' names. If you have any real legal questions, or you can always reach out to us afterwards, or your local employment counsel. So just keep that in mind. And look, with that, let's go through some of the big questions that we're getting and we're hearing from our clients. That's really how Joel and I like to present. And by the way, thank you to Joel, our founding partner of our firm, for joining me here today. So look, the two biggest developments, I would say, in the last 2 weeks are masks and incentives for vaccines. We'll get into some of that today, but let's start with, let's not bury the lead, right? Let's start with masks. And I guess the big question we're being asked, we're asking, we're hearing out there, I'm sure many of you want to know, is can you let your employees take off their masks in the workplace today? And it is fortuitous timing, right? Because today's June 4th, and that's the day that Governor Murphy has now allowed vaccinated employees in most industries, putting aside healthcare and schools and some other industries, prisons, things like that, can take off their masks. Can is the key word. So the short answer is yes. As of today, you have the CDC a couple of weeks ago saying vaccinated people can start taking off their masks indoors, and if they're vaccinated. And then you have New Jersey, as I mentioned before, changing its tune. First you have New Jersey right away saying, not yet. Governor Murphy announced, not yet, CDC, we're going to hold off. 2 days later, you have him saying, okay, public-facing employers can take off masks, right before Labor Day last week. You have restaurants and beaches, things like that. And then the next day, he changes his tune and says, okay, now pretty much every private employer can allow their vaccinated employees to take off their masks. If can, again, don't have to, and we'll get into some of that. And the really important distinction I just want to point out before I ask Joel the first question is, unlike the CDC, which says, hey, you can do the honor system, right? And some states say this. You can let your employees tell you if they're vaccinated or not and just kind of believe them. But New Jersey actually, this is really important, says you have to get proof of vaccination from your employees to allow them to take off their masks. And we'll get into some of that. There's some risks with that. There's some issues with that. So it's really important. Customers and visitors don't have to show proof. So if you have somebody coming in, you don't have to, although again, you can require the proof. So look, the basic is that yes, you can, as of today in most industries, allow your employees to take off masks. There's some risks, there's some issues we'll get into, but you can technically do it. So Joel, let me ask you, maybe you can, but should employers let their employees, their vaccinated employees, take off masks?
Well, thanks, Zeb, and thanks to the association for having us. We're honored to be presenting to you guys today, and we know that the answers are shifting, like the earth beneath us, and we're always mindful of the fact that we have to follow this stuff day to day. And we've been speaking on this for months, and it's changing a lot. I think the mask issue is a really interesting one, and we've been doing this. Zeb and I have been doing this together for a while, and I've been predicting that this was coming, and I've been saying it for months that they were going to have the next frontier were masks, where they were going to create essentially a two-tier system where you've got one body of employees that potentially would be wearing masks that are unvaccinated, and potentially one that is fully vaccinated and would be wearing masks. And there are risks with that. And let's just talk about that for a moment, and there's risks on many different levels, not just legal. But one of the things that you should know is that there are, and I'll talk about that in a few seconds, but there are people that literally have disabilities and other reasons. We'll talk about religious reasons or disability-oriented reasons that they can't get the vaccine, hypothetically. Okay, let's just put that out there. There are people that cannot get the vaccine. So if they can't get the vaccine and they're seen wearing a mask, even though we don't have a lot of guidance from OSHA or the EEOC or government agencies on this, do they have some form of discrimination claim that they're being ostracized? Okay, and let's just talk about that from the standpoint of it not being even legal. You're creating a leper colony here, okay, potentially, and that's a problem. Listen, we have a lot of clients that are doing that now, and I get that and I understand it. But are we opening ourselves up? And we have started to see that from clients too. And listen, people want to give rewards to folks that have gotten the vaccine. Okay, so people that have, at this point, people that can get the vaccine and want to get the vaccine have gotten the vaccine. But now you've got a situation where, you've got folks that may be banned from a lunchroom. They're walking around with a mask and people are kind of making fun of them. There may be some bullying. Listen, there's plenty of places in the country where the bullying may go the other way. But there's also issues with the idea that there's maybe a perceived disability on those people. Also, what happens if somebody feels unsafe going back to work? Let's just say you have a 20-person company, a small company, and you've got 2 employees that are wearing masks. One of them actually is unvaccinated, but the other one is just being overly cautious because they want to continue to wear a mask. And suddenly that person who's actually being super cautious is now made fun of because they're wearing a mask. And the thing with that is that realistically, there are privacy protection laws here that protect the employees from having their status as being vaccinated or unvaccinated from being known by everybody.
Sorry to cut you off. Before you get to the privacy issue, I do want to go hone in on something you said, which is, you're talking about bullying and lunchrooms. Can you elaborate a little more on that? You said it's not necessarily a legal concern, but what's the issue? So an employee, says something to another employee who's masked or unmasked. What do you think the problem is with that?
Look, I think especially with the delicate issues of people's psyche and mental health, of people coming back to work, and everybody trying so hard to keep their culture working. Okay, it's been hard enough through the past year and change to make that work. Suddenly you're getting people back, and now you're having some people wear masks and some people not wearing masks. And once again, I understand the idea of doing that, but I think that we've already seen evidence in some of our clients where there's a situation where People are teasing people. People are guessing that they've been vaccinated or not vaccinated. And there's situations that we know of where people that are wearing masks have been vaccinated. They're just choosing to wear masks. You can see that happening. So there's misunderstanding. There's all sorts of things. But I think that one of the things that companies are trying to do now is create a level of uniformity. Okay, in the sense that they want their culture to be working, people to be working. I mean, that's one of the main reasons that I see companies wanting to get that are actually functioning pretty well remotely, wanting to get people back to the office, is because they want people to be working with a little more camaraderie that maybe is missing in the remote sense. Well, if you want that camaraderie, and then you suddenly have certain people wearing masks and certain people not wearing masks, and we've seen some issues with that, but I expect that to continue for a while. I do, and as I was discussing a few seconds ago, the thing also is that maybe it's the HR person and a second person that actually has the information and knows who's vaccinated and who's not vaccinated. But does a line supervisor in the warehouse really know that? We're not advocating from a legal perspective that every manager in the company knows who and who isn't vaccinated, and it's going to be hard for them to police.
And you can't, I mean, look, the federal law, the EEOC has put out guidance that says that once, you're allowed to ask people, are you vaccinated? That's a question we'll get to later, but you're allowed to ask them to prove it. But then the question is, what do you do with that information? You can't just announce who's vaccinated. You can't make people wear a bracelet or a sticker to show they're vaccinated. So you're right, Joel, in a warehouse, 200 people, you don't know who's vaccinated and who's not. Who's enforcing this mask on, mask off rule, right?
You think, a supervisor could say, I suspect that person's not wearing a mask, and I have reasonable suspicion that they're not vaccinated because I overheard a conversation. And you're going to get into all this kind of thing where you're going to be putting people into awkward positions, and people may start saying things that open up themselves and open up the company to some discrimination accusations as well, I think, here too.
I agree. And again, there's the safety issue where, let's say you do want to implement, you want to reward the people who've been vaccinated, you want to let them take off their masks, but you can't tell all your managers how to enforce it and who's vaccinated and who's not. So you have a situation where you have, let's say, 200 people, some are masked, some are not. Who's checking, right? Who's making sure that the unmasked people are actually vaccinated? You can't tell all your managers because it's a private piece of information, the confidential information of who's vaccinated. So let's say you can't enforce it very well, or you day to day there are masks coming off by unvaccinated people. You have a real safety issue, right? You have a lot of unvaccinated people without masks, which violates the guidance and poses risk to spread the virus back in your workplace.
Yeah, I think what we're really seeing the beginnings of this, and it's going to be very interesting to see how the mask issue unfolds. Masks have been politicized since the beginning of this pandemic, and there's been kind of a split on them, and now it's kind of, even in the waning days, let's hope waning days of COVID within this country, you're seeing masks again being a dividing line.
That's a great point. That's a great point. And I think your point, Joel, about it being more of a non-legal issue is really astute, because look, New Jersey has specifically put out, you can take the mask off. CDC is guidance, you can take the mask off. So it's not a black and white, black and white legal. You probably can allow your employees to take off their masks, but
the vaccinated employees.
How that, right. But the question is how that affects your culture. Is there going to be bullying? Are all the unmasked folks going to go out to lunch and leave the masked person home? So.
And I want to reiterate what you said, Zev, because you dropped it in there. But this is not about, a lot of people say, well, I have a right to do this and that. I have a right to do with customers. Now, you have a right to say customers, which you said, they have to wear masks coming into your business. Guests who you don't know. I mean, that's going to be hard to police. Walmart was one of the first national companies that decided to go with this two-tier system of vaccinated workers having to wear masks or not having to wear masks, and the others not. But they never opened up customers.
And New Jersey has its own interesting, vibe. I was just in a Walgreens the other day, and it's optional, and there was an employee not wearing a mask, and I saw a fight. I saw a customer yell at the employee and say, "Put on your mask," and the employee says, "I'm allowed not to." So again, it's and that's just a customer and an employee. Imagine your employees among each other, that could be a problem. So it's just some food for thought. I want to mention the other big change that New Jersey put out just a week ago when Governor Murphy changed some of these rules is, previously, and this is kind of not talked about, a lot of people don't realize that until about a week ago, New Jersey still had guidance in effect from the governor that, if employees can work from home, they should. It's recommended. It wasn't kind of black and white, they have to, but it was this push towards, you really should let your people work from home. So this new executive order that Governor Murphy just put out a week ago says that's not the case now. So while you may have to consider work from home options if people have disabilities or need accommodations, and that's really, specific to situations, there is no longer this guidance out there from New Jersey that you have to, push to let people work from home. And now we're seeing it with our clients. A lot of return to the work, a lot of return to the work site, a lot of what does it look like? Are we doing a flexible schedule or a hybrid? The future of work is going to be very, very different, even if the pandemic passes. So that's just something I want to point out, which we will get into. But Joel, let me kind of back up a second here, because we did jump right into masks, which is the hot topic of the day. But related to masks, we still have lots of employers asking the question, well, can I require vaccines in the workplace to come back to work, right? I want, let's say, everybody to take off their mask, but I also want everybody to be vaccinated. So this has been the question for months, but can employers require the vaccine?
Well, yeah, and I think, it ties into masks because, one of the things that's very interesting, we've polled this before, is that there's really a healthy part of the population, the workplace population, that are not getting vaccinated. And listen, they have access to the vaccine at this point within this country. That's for sure. Employers are trying all sorts of means to get people vaccinated, so people have access to them, and they're not potentially doing that. And I'm wondering, actually, in this kind of situation, in the situation that we're describing here, where you're seeing employers allowing the vaccinated people, almost as a reward for being vaccinated, to not wear masks, if that's going to change that equation, and more people are going to say, listen, I don't want to be ostracized here. I'm feeling like a minority I'm feeling like a minority of the workplace population, that I'm having to wear a mask. Maybe I'll get vaccinated. I don't know if that's going to change things. We'll see there. But, technically, it's been the same somewhat since December of last year, which is that it is not considered a medical exam. The EEOC was clear on December 15th of last year that you can require your employees to get a vaccine. Now, should you require your employees to get a vaccine? We'll see in a few moments that it's generally, from our position, frowned upon to mandate the vaccination, because there are some hurdles that go in that. But we are seeing more and more people push towards that, and there's other ways to potentially try to get people to take the vaccine, and there's limitations there. But I think one of the things that you always have to ask yourself, and this is just a threshold question, if you will. Let's just say, I want you to figure it out from the outset. 25% of your population, let's say, is not vaccinated. Let's just say that, okay? You've got 75% vaccinated, 25% not vaccinated. And let's say amongst that 25% of unvaccinated employee, there's 5 or 6 awesome employees, okay? Now, when you make a mandatory vaccine policy and those people don't want to get vaccinated, the 20 mediocre employees may be, okay, that's it. But those 5 employees, are you prepared to fire them? You got to be thinking that way too.
And let me jump in on that, because the EEOC, which is the federal agency that administers these discrimination laws, did update their guidance. And it's interesting, their phrasing, because what they said was, you're allowed to require vaccines for your employees to physically come back and enter the workplace, right? So what the EEOC did not say was, even if you require a vaccine, you can automatically fire somebody who doesn't say that they're going to get the vaccine. So you have to be careful there, to Joel's point, which is, yes, you may be able to require the vaccine for people to come into your physical office space. And actually, New Jersey's doubled down on that. New Jersey specifically said the same thing as the EEOC, which is, yes, you can require vaccines for people to come in. But, to Joel's point, are you willing to exclude your best performers if they don't want to get vaccine, or keep them out, or, potentially get to the point where you fire them if you're going to have to do that for non-vaccinated people? So,
I want to clarify, notwithstanding disability or religion and things we'll discuss in a moment, the EEOC isn't saying you can't fire people.
Correct. It's just a tougher threshold. And I agree, Joe. Let's say you have somebody who says, no, I'm not getting vaccinated, not for a religious or a medical reason. I just don't like it. I just don't like it. I don't believe in vaccines, whatever the thing is. That's somebody that you may possibly consult your employment lawyer, but you may be able, Joel's right, to enforce that policy and fire them. But do you want to, if they're the top performer? Or what's that going to do to your culture if you just throw out people and
Yeah,
so,
I mean, I think before you're, and it's just something we're going to layer in as broken record, and it's not, I don't want it to be perceived as self-serving, but I think employment lawyers figure prominently in some of your decisions here, both in reviewing your policy decisions and the individual terminations if it comes to that. So I think it's important to just double check all these things with counsel and not make these decisions on your own.
And let me just, argue the flip side just for 1 second. Look, we have seen successful mandated vaccine policies in certain workplaces, right? So we're not sitting here saying, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. What we're saying is, if you're going to do it, play chess. Think 5 steps ahead and say, okay,
be prepared for the consequences.
That's right. Be willing to live with the consequences. And the last thing you want is, okay, we're going to require vaccines, and then people say no, and then what happens? Nothing happens. You kind of lose some credibility, or the people who did get vaccinated and listen to your rule are saying, well, why did I do it if you're not going to enforce it? So, think 3 steps ahead and plan ahead if you are going to require this thing. So, there are a couple of legal concerns if you're going to require vaccines. First of all, you have to make sure you make an exception for people who do have a legitimate medical condition or religious objection, sincerely held religious belief to vaccine. So if somebody has a medical condition, can't get it, obviously you have to discuss accommodations with them. There's a whole complicated legal process that you really have to engage in. You can't just say, all right, you're staying home, or, okay, you now have to, adjust your work schedule. You have to engage with the employee. It's called the interactive process, not to get too legal on you. But if there is somebody who comes with a religious or medical exception to a vaccination policy, be careful. You have to engage. You have to make those exceptions. The other thing I just want to mention is, again, you can ask employees if they've been vaccinated, but you have to keep it confidential. You can ask for proof, but you have to keep that proof confidential. It's confidential medical information, so you can't just tell every manager who's vaccinated and who's not. And then one other point on the legal risks here is, and this is just kind of a throwaway or a side point, but for those of you who've been vaccinated and may not have, but some of you may have read the literature that you get when you get vaccinated, there is some language on there from the FDA that because the vaccines haven't been fully FDA approved, right, but only approved under this emergency use authorization, there's language you get when you get vaccinated which says, or right before I think you get vaccinated, which says, you are not, it's not allowed for you to be required to be vaccinated. So that's a little confusing. It's not talking about employers. We still have, on the employment law level, we have this allowance from New Jersey and from the EEOC that you can require vaccines, but it could be confusing. Employees are going to see a piece of paper that says you're not, nobody can force you to get a vaccine. And there's 1 or 2 lawsuits out there in the country, people suing the FDA and all kinds of issues about FDA approval, but that's just something you should be aware of. It's a little.
And that's been, I think that's been a surprising development that some folks have taken that track.
Right.
And we don't know, by the way, we have no idea if that's going to be successful or not.
Right. I agree. I don't know that will get anywhere, but there is a piece of paper that says to people who are being asked, they're forced to do vaccines from their employer, that no one can force you to do it. So it's a little bit odd.
The primary line of attack that we've been anticipating is along the lines of things around perceived disability, and religion.
Correct. So Joel, other than those legal concerns, what are the other issues you're seeing with, let's say, required, vaccines?
I just think though that it's important, to just, I just want to make sure that people understand that, you have to be careful of what you can and can't ask, with regard to the vaccination. In other words, you can ask, have you been vaccinated? At what point, I just want to feed it back to you before we move on. At what point, do you stop the inquiry about getting a vaccine or not getting a vaccine?
And we get this a lot, right? People love to talk about what's going on, what their opinions are on the vaccine. So let's say you're the employer and you're not requiring a vaccine, but you just want to know who's vaccinated and who's not for your mask policies or otherwise. Like I said, you can ask, are you vaccinated? You can ask for proof of the vaccine. You can ask, when were you vaccinated? What vaccine did you get? What you can't do and shouldn't do is engage with the employee on why they may not have gotten vaccinated or their family medical history. And people love to talk. We see it all the time where it's just polite. An employee says, well, no, I haven't gotten vaccinated because I had asthma and my brother has this and my cousin has this. You don't stop it. You don't want that information. It's medical information that, is extra protected. You now have medical information about your employee that if anything ever, you discipline the employee down the road, they could argue you did it because of their medical conditions, things like that. So, while you're allowed to ask if they're vaccinated and those basic questions, don't get any other medical information, don't get family medical or genetic information.
And I think that's, that really is one of the reasons that if you are going to go the mandatory route, okay, let's say you really want to do it. What we'll strongly advise as an initial step is don't do it on site. Don't bring a contractor in or have your own nurse do it or somebody else do it like that. I think there's a lot of additional challenges with that. And I think that you really don't want to do that. You'd be better off saying, go to your primary care physician, go to CVS or Walgreens or one of the pharmacies, come back in with the proof, with the card that you've gotten it. I mean, that's honestly, a much more passive way. And I think that you're certainly increasing your risk by doing it yourself and being responsible for asking all those questions, those medical questions. Because for those of you that have been vaccinated, you know that when you got vaccinated, you had to answer a lot of medical information.
One in-between solution we've seen where, look, we have clients that are saying, well, okay, you're telling us, Zev, Joel, that bringing in a vendor and doing it ourselves comes with all this legal risk. Fine, but we have a workforce that we think will get vaccinated. They're lazy. They don't want to go in the middle of the day. Can we make this easier for them? So one solution that we've heard is not contracting, not paying, somebody to come in or giving the vaccine yourself, but there are logistics where you can contact local CVS or local vendor and say, hey, can you set up shop outside our business? We have a hospitality group that has 5 restaurants together that's done that. And so employers not asking the questions, employers not involved in the process, but they're making it a little easier, and telling employees, hey, go in the corner if you want, there's a vaccine.
And I know schools have done that with students too. It's an interesting way. The more disconnected you are though to the vaccination process, the better it is. If you are going to go mandatory, let's put it that way. That would just be what we would say with that for sure, because the reason we're saying this is that there's prohibitions on asking too much in terms of disability related history that stimulates disability oriented discrimination lawsuits, and that's something that we're always conscious of. And listen, with regard to having mandatory vaccine policies or vaccine passports, the way New York State is trying to go, there's a lot. That's a political hot potato. It's been so now for months, and we're seeing emerging state law and different decisions all along the line, where the federal law may be somewhat silent on certain things, and there may be some emerging things that come down the pike. Whereas New Jersey is certainly supporting the fact that you can require a vaccine, there are other states that are banning mandatory vaccine policies, plenty of them. So for those of you that are employers that have workers in other states, and that's by the way, just as an aside, a complete tangent, one of the issues that we've seen since the pandemic started is that employers have employees that are relocating to all parts of the world and certainly all parts of the country. And so if you've got an employee located in a state far away from New Jersey or wherever that has a different set of laws, and let's say they ban the mandatory vaccine, well, you've got to be cognizant of that. Okay, so I think we have to look into that.
Not to mention overtime rules and discrimination rules and tax rules and all the other stuff that comes with having.
Yeah, we speak to clients about that in almost a checklist form. before the, if they have an employee in a different state, these are the things that they've got to look towards in terms of doing things differently. You actually bring my attention to some other legal concerns with making the mandatory vaccine. Look, what if people suffer some severe reaction from the vaccine? Are you responsible for that? Does workers' comp pick up the liability if somebody has a severe reaction or a blood clotting situation like you saw with some of the vaccines earlier, things like that? It's not really clear. I'll be honest with you, it's not really clear. We haven't seen lawsuits go through the system to give us clear answers here. And, it's been a problem from the very beginning of COVID as to whether or not, even with getting COVID at the workplace, whether or not something like workers' comp would pick up. These are such unusual circumstances. So I think we don't have a clear answer there. But once again, if the policy isn't a mandatory one, I think your risk is mitigated substantially there. I think the other thing that you've got to understand, though, if you are making it mandatory and people go out because you're making them go get the vaccine, and you don't, let's say, pay them overtime or not consider work time, don't calculate it into the way you're paying them, you potentially have a wage and hour issue.
Or even, are you paying them, let's say the only appointment they can get is 2 p.m., are you paying them for that time out? So New Jersey, and actually New Jersey just recently announced confirming that, the legal New Jersey sick time that you're required to give your employees is permitted for employees to use that time to both get a vaccine and to, if they have side effects or recovering from the vaccine, they can use their sick time, and I guess
some states are giving I think New York gives PTO for that time.
Correct. New York passed a law saying you have to give up to 4 hours per shot for time off, but Jersey is saying you can use the sick time, and then look, we're going to get into incentives in a minute. You, the company, can add on top of that. You can give a free day off for people to go get vaccinated. We'll talk about that.
And it's also interesting with respect to those of you that have unionized workforces that before you do anything, that's your line in the sand, mandatory vaccine policy, whatever, make sure that you have a conversation with the union first too. Okay, that's another battlefield that you don't necessarily want to confront, and I think that's important.
That's right. Look, I think where the rubber meets the road on mandatory vaccines, or even encouraging people's vaccines, is employees refusing. Right? Let's say, putting aside the religious and the medical issues we've talked about, you have employee relations issues, as Joel kind of alluded to before. You have a climate where, look, it depends on your industry, it depends on what percentage of your workforce is or is not interested in the vaccine. We have a client down in Alabama, a mile down the road from Tuskegee, where they did vaccine testing of African Americans for many years. 60–70% of their workforce, it doesn't want to get vaccinated, maybe with good reason. So I think a lot of this is, like Joel also mentioned, we as employment lawyers are talking about the law a lot of the time, but we try really hard also to talk about culture and employee relations. Legal, as Joel always says, and I'll take this from Joel's mouth, legal is just one part of the equation, right? We recognize that there's business and there's profit and there's employee relations and there's PR, how you look outside to your customers. Legal is just one piece of the equation. So, where the rubber meets the road is, your employees don't want to get the vaccine, are resisting it, again, putting aside the legal issues with that. And, employee retention, we hear, as everyone out there knows, there are big issues these days with finding good talent, and hiring seems to be a concern because of the robust unemployment benefits we're all hearing about. So, there are all these other non-legal considerations, PR, where, we recognize that you have to consider those, not just, black and white, can we require this?
I think you touched on part. I think the major overriding issue is people's refusal to get the vaccine versus companies wanting to have a safe workplace. Okay, and that's the rub. And almost every issue we're discussing today really deals with that conflict, because that's what the conflict is.
That's balancing safety and concerns, both from a liability perspective and just wanting to do the right thing and keep your employees safe and your business safe, versus, like you said, Joel, the rewarding people to take off masks, getting back to work, you know, keeping people happy. It's a tough, you know, there's no answer, unfortunately. There's just no clear answer right now.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that's been very hard, I think, throughout the COVID experience for companies and for individuals is that we are a very divided nation. And that, you know, like I said, companies now have people working in more different locations than ever before. And the blue states and the red states, I'm not, you know, it's not so strict because there's plenty of states that are kind of in between, have taken some different tacks. And for example, you know, in Florida, there's a ban on those vaccine passports. Right, and you know, and it's interesting because in many other countries, they've actually spread, and that's an interesting thing. You know, one of the things that I'm seeing happening in Florida is cruise ships are starting to want to get going right now. And you know, Florida is not, and the cruise ships want folks to be vaccinated, and they want the vaccine passport, and Florida's banning that. So until that's resolved, and this is just an aside, and but it's the type of conflict we're seeing. You know, do the cruise ships now go to alternative ports where they could get that? So it's going to be very interesting. So the state law on this stuff is going to have monumental implications in the way the businesses within those states continue to operate.
Also, there's a lot of wait and see. You know, look, today it's Friday the 4th. Today is the first day effective in New Jersey where non-public facing businesses are permitted to allow their vaccinated employees to take off masks. You know, a lot of people are eager. When the governor went, you know, he had 2 days in a row where he issued these executive orders changing the rules in New Jersey. And a lot of clients called us, you know, that evening, late at night. Okay, I read the executive order. Can I take my mask off now? You know, a lot of times, as we've seen in the last year and a half, wait and see sometimes works. You may have eager employees who, you know, really want to get rewarded, so to speak, for getting vaccinated or get this dang thing off my face. But sometimes it's not the worst thing in the world to give it a few weeks and see, you know, if there's more guidance, or see how, you know, the employees react, see how other big companies are doing it. You know, sometimes that's something that our clients think about.
And I have, you know, my feeling on all of these things. You know, first of all, you know, we in the state are not necessarily advocating eliminating your safety requirements. I think you're keeping your safety requirements in place until told otherwise. There's no question that some of that is likely to be, you know, things progress as they're progressing, to be loosened over time, but nobody's advocating loosening those things. And I would say that, you know, the companies that I think that have moved successfully in the direction of getting people back to work better have crawled before they've walked. They've baby stepped it and kind of moved a little slow. First, we're going to do this, then we're going to do this. So, you know, I think making radical rip the Band-Aid off decisions may be difficult. I mean, as a complete aside, you know, even getting people back that have enjoyed working remotely to now working potentially full-time, you know, there's an awful lot of polls out there that suggest that's not going to play well with a lot of workers, and it is
will cause some attrition. And will cause some attrition. You know,
it's a tough labor market to recruit, so you have to think that one clearly too. You know, the other thing that I don't know we touched on, Zev, is the idea of still providing for somebody that can't get vaccinated, maybe for a legitimate reason due to their disability. What kind of accommodation do you suggest for those people?
Right. So let's say you require the vaccination, and then, you know, somebody just can't. Right. So, you know, you can't necessarily just fire them. You have to, like I said before, engage with them, have this interactive discussion as what you can do. Work from home might be a possibility depending on the position. You know, let's say even though, let's say everybody else is vaccinated, they keep their mask on, they get the side office, they have a flexible schedule. So there are things, you know, if people just can't get vaccinated, there are accommodations you can consider. It's not the easiest thing because you're at work and it's an airborne virus. So you really have to be creative and think about, you know, what options you have for the people who can't get vaccinated, who need that accommodation. Work from home is the easiest one. If they can.
And the rule of law on these things in general is that, you know, a reasonable accommodation discussion is important. So you have to enter into the interactive process if somebody's got a disability and wants a potential accommodation, but okay, it cannot pose an undue hardship on you as a company. And that's part of the factoring into deciding all this. But there's a lot of gradations to get there.
Yeah, no, it's really, like I said before, there's a really technical legal process here that if somebody does identify, not just in the COVID context, but if somebody identifies a need for something in the workplace or a change based on their disability, based on a religious belief, you have to, again, go to your local friendly employment council, or you have to really, baby steps and be careful. Before we get to questions, because I certainly think that we'll have some, and I really want to open this up. The other really big news that came out recently from the EEOC, the federal agency, last week was about incentives. From the very beginning, employers have asked, can we pay people to get vaccinated? Can we give vacation days to get people vaccinated? There's been some risks. There's been some kind of open-endedness to this inquiry. But right now, the federal government has come out with this guidance that says, essentially, yes, that, big update is that you can incentivize your employees to vaccinate. If you're, like Joel said before, another benefit to not doing your vaccines in-house, if you're doing them in-house, if you yourself or your vendor is giving the vaccines, you got to be a little more careful with these incentives, right? Because you can't make the incentives so big that you're now kind of requiring people to get the on-site vaccine. So the EEOC says, look, if you're giving the vaccine yourself to employees, be a little more careful with your incentives and make sure they're not too big. But they don't set any other limitations. If you're telling people, we encourage you to go to CVS or Walgreens and get vaccinated, you can give them a $500 gift card, and I would be careful not to go too high, and I'll talk about why in a minute. But, we've seen out there really creative incentives, free Uber rides, cash prizes, a free day off. Really, Ohio did, and New York is doing the same thing, a lottery for anybody vaccinated can enter $1 million lottery. I wouldn't suggest $1 million, but I've seen some clients and employers who want to do, everyone who's vaccinated can enter for $5,000, $1,000 prizes, so there isn't.
I think when we're going, I certainly agree that most of the Fortune 500 companies and most of our clients have taken the incentive route as opposed to the mandatory route. It's not, because it does eliminate some of those difficult problems and questions we discussed earlier. That being said, there's not a guarantee that, as Zev's alluding to, that somebody could say, well, I couldn't get the vaccine, I've got an immunodisorder, and I'm not getting this incentive, so I'm suing you because I've been discriminated against based on my disability, that I don't not get a sticker or a bottle of water, but I'm actually not getting that day off or the $500 and those kinds of things. So I think that when you're saying that there's risks, I think that's some of the risk. I mean, but then again, I just want to weigh in here for a second. I know we're going to get to questions soon. There's risks on both sides on these decisions, period. Like I said, between the idea of discrimination on one side, safety on the other side, and you've got to make a decision as an employer. Unfortunately, that's not always completely clean here. In fact, it's often not completely clean. And what we're suggesting is that the incentive route, although there is some risk potentially there, it seems to be, from a balancing of safety versus discrimination, the greatest path to probably take.
There are also options to mitigate that risk, right? So let's say you have, the lottery ticket example where everyone who's vaccinated and shows us proof enters in the lottery, and you have somebody, or somebody raises an issue with a disability where they can't get the vaccine. You can give them the option to enter the lottery if they take a safety course, or if they do something else that's not getting a vaccine, but maybe that's COVID related, to get that entry into the lottery. So you can mitigate some of the risk Joel's mentioning, but I don't disagree, Joel. I think that this seems to be the way that most companies are going, which is, some kind of incentive, a day off, an hour off, a gift card, a water bottle, whatever you're giving for the vaccines, again, depending on your workforce and your culture and your industry. But just be careful of the haves and the have-nots, right? Be careful of, if the reward is too big, again, even if people are just objecting to the vaccine because they're objecting to the vaccine, think back to Joel's point about people going out to lunch, without masks, people that have the gift card, going shopping together, I think you just have to be aware of your culture and be aware of, creating the second-class citizenship or creating the leper colony of haves and have-nots. But ultimately, EEOC is saying you can incentivize. Many companies are doing it, and frankly, we've seen it working. For people who are really not going to get the vaccine, $50, $100 is not going to push them to do it.
We've been recommending it
on the fence, it will.
And we've been recommending that as probably the best course of action, even long before the EEOC came out with any guidance. I mean, it just, like I said, this is a jungle of risk out there. It's been that way for a while. You're just going to have to choose what you think is the best path.
And on that note, let's leave some time. So thank you, Amy, if you don't mind letting us know what questions are out there.
Once
Sure,
again, a
yes.
reminder that it's informational too, not legal advice.
Yes, right, Joel. I do want to emphasize that. And look, we're happy to entertain informational questions and kind of talk through some scenarios. But remember, what these answers are not formal legal advice, and talk to your counsel about that. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, we definitely had some questions come through. The first one is if we decide to have vaccinated and unvaccinated personnel in our warehouse, is it okay to have two separate break rooms? One where the unvaccinated have to social distance and the other one where vaccinated employees do not have to distance?
That is a really, really good question. And I want to say that, and I want Joel's thoughts on this one, but we've given this talk a number of times and always have really interesting questions. And quite a while ago, even before this mask mandate was lifted for vaccinated folks, Joel was talking about this a lot and was saying, well, can you have separate offices? Can you have separate, and I think, my initial thought on that is legally, black and white, I don't see an actual concern. I don't see something I can point to say you can't do that. But I go right back to the main concern we've been saying is this, haves and have-nots, this culture of divisiveness. Joel, what do you think?
Well, I think it opens the door to some problems. If you're looking at it from a strictly black letter standpoint under the law, it's not clear that there's an avenue to attack this legally. From our standpoint right now, I mean, that could change. Who knows where things go, and there could be, we never anticipated the FDA argument, nobody did, that someone was going to make an emergency use based lawsuit. That was strange. But, I think that, I think it's impossible to make employment law decisions without some cultural concerns. Okay, and I think there are cultural concerns here. And the first time now you have a vaccinated person that is wearing a mask that comes into the vaccinated break room, is there going to be a fight?
Great point. And the other thing I just thought of is let's make sure that the vaccinated break room isn't much nicer. It doesn't have better couches, doesn't have better soft drinks. You don't want to, again, feel like that first and second class citizen thing. But Joel, that's a great point. Just because you're wearing a mask doesn't mean you are or not vaccinated. It could just mean you're being careful.
I think we're seeing a lot of companies that have, people that are, listen, there's a lot of folks that are going to be wearing masks for a long time. Okay, even after being vaccinated, and they're not just because nobody necessarily, nobody's saying just because the CDC or some state body says that you can get rid of your mask. There's not a lot of trust out there, and so people that let's say have pre-existing conditions or maybe are elderly or things like that are a little more concerned potentially, or just people that are more concerned. Period. They're going to continue to wear masks, and I alluded to that before. Not every, most people in the company are not going to know who's vaccinated and unvaccinated, and they're not going to believe each other. And I just see some real problems if we create this this system where we have two different ways of life within the company.
Yeah, Amy, you start us off with a good one.
Yeah,
I thought that was pretty good. All right, so another question came through, and I think you may have touched on this a little bit, but can you ask employees to send proof of vaccination by sending in a photo of their vaccination card?
Yeah.
The short answer is yes, but again, you have to treat it confidentially. So you can't have them, I wouldn't recommend you send it straight to their low-level manager or send it to a group or something like that. The answer is clearly yes, but it has to be kept.
Keep the information private.
Sorry, Joel?
But keep the information private.
And what that means, we get a lot of questions on this. Private,
don't commingle it with the personnel file.
correct. It's a separate file. It's kept confidentially, and we get a lot of questions on, well, who can know, right? Is it one person? Is it the owner? Is it HR? It isn't really a black and white answer to that, other than to say you can't spread it around. You can't let every single group's manager know who and who isn't vaccinated. I would say, Joel said it before, I think, I would say one or two folks, let's say HR and some senior manager, to enforce, whatever the vaccine rules are going to be. But it is confidential information, but you can ask for it.
Okay. Now, if you have somebody who comes in and they're interviewing for a position, if they're, can you ask them if they're vaccinated? If they say no, can you ask if they're willing to get it if they're hired?
So, we get this one a lot. So I think start backwards, right? So let's start with, do you have a required vaccine policy? If the answer to that is no, if you do not have a required vaccine policy in your company, then asking those questions up front, and then let's say you don't hire the person because they aren't getting vaccinated or aren't vaccinated, you've now essentially created a required vaccine policy for your applicants. So just be aware of that consistency, that, do you want to be treating your applicants and your current employees differently? We've actually, among our own firm, we had a really interesting, colorful debate about this, of whether can you set different rules for new employees, for applicants, versus current employees.
And it was spurred, I had been at an airport and I was talking to some personnel there, and Delta Airlines later that day, and they had announced it, but I was speaking to them about that, but they have a bifurcated rule where existing employees, there is no mandatory policy. They're just, I guess, assuming that there's a certain percentage that's vaccinated or unvaccinated, but for new hires, there's a mandatory vaccine rule being imposed. So that's an interesting thing. We haven't seen that with any of our clients.
Correct. So I guess my answer is that the question itself, just asking an applicant, are you vaccinated or not, or are you willing to get vaccinated? Again, like many of these answers, I don't see a clear legal challenge to asking that question. I guess where the rubber meets the road is if you don't hire the person ultimately, is there going to be an issue if they're disabled and can't get the vaccine, or they say you treat them differently or something like that?
I'm going to take a more conservative approach to that answer. And I'm going to suggest, although I think that I'm not disagreeing with Zev, I would suggest not asking that. And before you do ask that kind of question, I want you to see a lawyer and see if it dovetails with the rest of your policies and protocols. Okay, that question in and of itself, in a vacuum, without knowing what your policies are, because I think you are in effect beginning to create a mandatory vaccine policy by asking people that. So I think in a vacuum, I'm going to say no, but there's the possibility of yes. So I'm going to pull back and be a little more conservative on that one.
Okay, and then we've had another question come in. Is there less of a potential legal liability if on-site vaccinations are done on a voluntary basis?
I think so. That's a great question. There's two legal concerns with the vaccines that we're talking about. One is, are you requiring it or are you not requiring it, right? So to that, if you're not requiring it, right, then you don't have those legal concerns that we talked about of compelling it and worrying about people with disabilities and getting extra medical information. And what do you do if people say no? So on that one, I think you're safer. But on the other legal risk that Joel talked about was when you administer it yourself, you're still getting a whole lot of medical information with those screening questions and with all that information that is extra protected and that you now know about your employee. So even the EEOC is saying there's a lot more restrictions and you have to be a lot more careful when you do it yourself or in-house. So you've dealt with the mandatory issue, but you're still getting this medical information. You have to be extra careful.
It's a great question, and I think if you are gonna go that route, you're better off having some contractor that's that's disconnected from you as an employer do that. So let them answer.
The rule of thumb I thought was really good, which is the further removed you are. We understand there's steps and there's different levels, but the more you can kind of step away, the safer you'll be legally.
But I think that's a great question too. I really like that question a lot, because I think, you know, employers are really trying to be creative here. They mostly want a vaccinated workforce, but they don't want legal hassles in the route to getting there. So I like the way you're thinking, and I think it's interesting. If you're going to go that route, I'm not making it mandatory, but provide an easy thing. And I think Zev talked about situations like that. I think you want to be as disconnected as possible, even on premises, with the vendors that are doing the work.
Okay, so we have time for one last question, and here it is. Is there a firm date where employers can require employees to return to work vaccinated or not? Especially for places that never close.
Right. I mean, so the answer is no. You know, like I said before, New Jersey has lifted the kind of guidance that says you really have to let people work from home. So that's the first step. Is, you know, already for a couple of months we've told clients that, listen, if you have a business need or you have a reason, tell your people to come back if you want to. So the answer is no. You can do it tomorrow. I would caution that, like Joel said, baby steps. If, you know, people have made arrangements, whether it's daycare, childcare arrangements, whether it's, you know, commuting arrangements to work from home. So I suggest some lead time. Do it slow, announce it, maybe start with a limited capacity or a couple days a week, whatever works for your business. But the short answer is there's no date. You can do it now, but you know, be aware of the safety rules. So if you have unvaccinated people, they still have to wear a mask and all of that.
Yeah, you know, what I would also say is we have the benefit of seeing a cross section of employers and what they're doing. And what I'm seeing, and I think Zev would echo this, is that many employers have been back for a long time. The employers that are now considering having people return to work, when and setting a schedule for that, it's a little daunting because they don't know really what their workers want, don't want, and, you know, maybe there's some room for surveying there. But what I think that you're going to be seeing is more and more folks, like we said before, are baby stepping this a little bit, but ultimately a lot of our clients that are now just getting back to work want to get fully back to work. They're waiting for the fall till kids are in school and so forth, making things a little bit easier. The children are expected to be back into school live in the fall, so after Labor Day. So we're seeing that happen a lot. But as Zev mentions, you know, you mentioned there's not a date that's a line in the sand under the law.
And I really think again, we keep talking about planning ahead 2 steps. You're gonna, you know, when you get people who say, I have an underlying medical condition, I can't be around other people, you're gonna need your counselor, you're gonna need to address those issues, but you also have to be ready for people to just say to you, well, I can't, and not for a legally protected reason. I can't because of my kids, I can't because of this, you know, I am afraid of public transportation. You know, there's a lot of, you know, when you do require it, just be prepared, you know, for those types of questions. You know, we've prepared a lot of these communications for clients, how to talk to your employees, to give them the lead time to say, look, we could let you back now, we could ask you back now, but we're giving you a few weeks to set up your life and to come back. You know, there's a lot of different angles you can take here. A lot of it is employee relations and communication and how you say it.
Great.
All right, so look, before I kick it over to Amy to conclude, thank you all very much. This was, I mean, some really great questions. We really enjoyed this. You can see our contact information there. You have any other follow-up questions or need our help, you know, you can definitely reach out to either of us at any time. And, you know, NJBIA is great. We support them wholeheartedly, and we really thank them for hosting us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you again for being here today. Don't forget, all of you will be receiving a recording of today's webinar and the slides via email. Lastly, when we close out of the webinar, a survey is going to come up on your screen that we hope you will fill out so we can understand how best to provide you important information in webinar format. Our next webinar will be our Human Resource Council meeting, non-competes and other restrictive covenants in New Jersey, which will take place on Wednesday, at 11 a.m. So feel free to register for the next NJBIA event at www.njbia.org. Also, we will be having our EEOC reception, which will be outside under the tent at Forest Gate Country Club on June 22nd. Both of these events can be found at the website, again, www.njbia.org. So until next time, for Joel Greenwald and Zev Singer from Greenwald Dougherty, this is Amy Music, thanking you for being with us today and wishing you a great day.
Thank you.